Hey guys, tonight we're taking a step back in time to a world of tight-laced beauty, deadly elegance, and a fashion choice that could literally take your breath away. No kidding. Picture yourself in Victorian England, where the sound of a corset being tightened was almost as common as the clinking of teacups. Women squeezed into these contraptions with such precision that their waists could be no more than 18 inches. But hold on. The reality of wearing one wasn't all pretty. Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive the experience. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I love hearing about how far my little bedtime stories are reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The corset. It's not just an undergarment. It's a cultural symbol, a hallmark of femininity and grace during the Victorian era. If you've ever watched a period drama or seen those old-timey portraits, you've probably seen women with impossibly small waists, wearing what seemed to be a metal cage wrapped around their torsos. But that tiny waist wasn't just about beauty. It was a statement. It was the ideal, the very thing that said a woman was respectable, well-bred, and able to conform to the highest expectations of society. And to achieve it, well, many women paid a deadly price. In the mid-1800s, the corset became synonymous with refined elegance. It was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a tool for shaping, sculpting, and crafting the body into the perfect hourglass. Women weren't just dressing to look good. They were dressing to meet an ideal that was both culturally and medically embedded in their lives. Tight, taut, and restrictive. Corsets shaped the waistline and supported the bust, creating a silhouette that many considered to be the epitome of grace and sophistication. But this devotion to fashion came with a darker side that would eventually claim lives and spark a revolution in how society viewed both fashion and health. Now, you might be wondering, how did such a simple garment hold so much power over women? Well, it wasn't just about the shape it gave their bodies. It was about the very essence of femininity itself. A small waist symbolized that a woman was delicate, fragile, and in need of protection, which, in the eyes of many, made her desirable. But there was more to it than that. Corsets were deeply tied to social class and status. The more extravagant the corset, the higher your rank in society. So, in a world where your worth was often determined by appearance, wearing a corset wasn't just about fashion, it was a survival tactic. But let's dive a little deeper into how corsets were actually made and worn, and what exactly made them so dangerous. Because, spoiler alert, the fashion world in Victorian times wasn't all about flowing dresses and lace. It was a minefield of health hazards just waiting to claim unsuspecting women. You probably think you know what a corset looks like, right? A tight, waist-hugging garment with laces at the back, making a woman's waist so small it could rival a doll's. But there's more to the corset than its outward appearance. It's the science behind it that makes it both fascinating and terrifying. At first glance, the corset seems like a simple contraption made of fabric, steel, and whalebone. But when you start digging into how it works, things get a little more intense. The main purpose of a corset was to achieve that coveted, wasp-waisted look. By tightly binding the torso, the garment would push internal organs into new positions, squeeze the ribs inward, and shape the body in ways that defied nature. A woman's waist would shrink, often down to just 18 inches or even smaller, while her bust and hips were accentuated. This wasn't just about style. It was about creating an idealized, exaggerated form of femininity that adhered to the cultural beauty standards of the time. But here's the kicker. The very design that created the beautiful, sculpted waistline also had dangerous consequences. You see, the corset didn't just compress the body, it restricted the organs. Organs that, are kind of essential for staying alive. For instance, the lungs were squished to the point where a woman wearing a tight corset often couldn't take a full breath. Instead of a nice, deep inhale, she'd be reduced to shallow gasps, often causing dizziness and fatigue. As for the ribs, they didn't exactly enjoy the corset's tight embrace either. Over time, the ribs could become permanently deformed, reshaped by the continuous pressure. Some women even reported having difficulty standing upright, feeling more like a puppet than a person, unable to move freely. But that's not all. Historians still argue whether the squeezing of internal organs contributed to a number of health issues that plagued Victorian women, including digestive problems, weakened pelvic organs, and restricted blood flow. A corset-clad woman often experienced issues like constipation and bloating because her intestines were literally being pushed out of their normal positions. Then, there was the pressure on the heart. With the diaphragm crushed and the lungs struggling for space, the heart had to work overtime just to circulate oxygen throughout the body. Over the long term, this could lead to a range of cardiovascular issues. Essentially, these women were suffocating in the name of beauty. It's hard to imagine that something so fashionable could have such a sinister side. But that was the reality for countless women who wore corsets daily. Corsets weren't just a way to make women look beautiful. They were tools of restriction. They were designed to shape, control, and compress the body into a form that society had deemed desirable. But at what cost? The physical toll of wearing a corset was immense. And yet, this was the price many women were willing to pay in order to maintain their social standing. But let's be clear, it wasn't like every woman willingly put herself in danger for beauty's sake. In fact, many women were expected to wear corsets from a young age, a standard practice that was ingrained in Victorian society. Young girls were often fitted with corsets as soon as they were able to wear them. It wasn't a choice. It was simply part of their upbringing. If a girl wanted to grow into a respectable, well-bred woman, she had no choice but to wear a corset. The social pressure was overwhelming, and many women, unfortunately, believed that their worth was defined by their appearance. This was the world of fashion during the Victorian era, a world where the waistline was a symbol of control, power, and beauty, even if it meant putting one's life on the line. Now, let's travel back even further, before the Victorian era, to the roots of the corset. You might think that the corset was a Victorian invention, but you'd be wrong. The journey of this iconic garment stretches far back into history, tracing its origins to the 1500s, where fashion was already evolving in ways that would eventually lead to the deadly contraption we know today. Back then, the corset wasn't quite the constricting, waist-shrinking device we think of. In fact, it was more of a bodice, or stays, worn by both men and women. Early versions of these garments were much less restrictive, focusing on creating a smooth silhouette rather than narrowing the waist. These early stays were often made of cloth, leather, or whalebone. and were designed to support the upper body while still allowing a reasonable range of motion. In the 16th century, corsetry was primarily a tool of the wealthy. The upper classes used it to accentuate their bodies in ways that demonstrated their social status. But corsets weren't just about luxury. They were also about practicality. In a world where women wore heavy, layered clothing, a corset helped to support the weight of the garments and gave a certain structure to the body. It wasn't about making women look tiny. It was more about supporting and shaping them in a way that made the clothing sit properly. By the time we hit the 18th century, corsets had already begun to evolve. They became more structured and form-fitting, with the waist narrowing and the chest and hips being accentuated. But it wasn't until the Victorian era that the corset truly became the iconic piece of clothing we know today. What changed during the Victorian period was a shift in the social norms surrounding women's bodies and beauty. Historians still debate whether the widespread popularity of the corset was purely a result of fashion, or whether it was also a way for society to impose control over women's bodies. In a time when women were expected to be delicate, frail, and submissive, the corset became an instrument of social control. Women were told that their worth was tied to their ability to meet society's standards of beauty. And the corset was the tool they used to achieve that ideal. The idea of a woman's body being tightly controlled was deeply ingrained in Victorian culture. This was a time when women were expected to be both seen and not heard, confined to domestic roles and stripped of much autonomy. The corset was a reflection of this mindset, a physical manifestation of the societal pressure to conform. But corsetry wasn't just about cultural expectations. It was also about health. The theory of ideal female beauty was closely linked with health, and women were often told that a small waist was the key to health and fertility. But the reality was that corsets, far from promoting health, were slowly suffocating women, causing both physical and psychological damage. It's fascinating, really, how a piece of clothing could hold so much weight, not just in terms of physical pressure on the body, but also in its role as a tool for social conformity. It was more than just a fashion statement. It was a symbol of how women were expected to look, behave, and in many cases, suffer for the sake of that appearance. But this obsession with the corset wasn't just limited to the women themselves. Men, too, had their role in this rigid system of beauty. Women were often pressured by society and their husbands to conform to the ideal. The corset was a way for men to assert their control over their wives' appearance. Fashion was, after all, a reflection of power, and the ability to shape a woman's body was a symbol of dominance. So, as we move forward in the story of the corset, keep in mind that it wasn't just about making women more beautiful. It was about shaping them into something society wanted, and forcing them to pay a high price for it. That price, as we'll soon discover, was not just physical. It was emotional and psychological too. As the 19th century marched forward, so too did the evolution of the corset. What had started as a simple bodice in the 1500s had now transformed into a highly engineered garment, one that used whalebone, steel, and other materials to give it rigidity. But this wasn't just a cosmetic upgrade. The materials used to make corsets had a profound impact on both their effectiveness and their danger. In the early days, corsets were often made with the bones of animals, specifically whale bones or whalebone. This gave the corset a certain flexibility while still providing the necessary structure to shape the body. But by the early 1800s, corsets were becoming more rigid, steel, and later, iron. replaced whalebone, allowing corsets to hold even tighter and maintain a more extreme shape. The introduction of steel was revolutionary, making corsets stronger and more durable than ever before. They could now shape a woman's body into an exaggerated hourglass figure, pushing her waist down to what could seem like impossible dimensions. This technological shift wasn't just about fashion. It was about creating a bodily ideal that was physically unattainable without the aid of a corset. Imagine the pressure on women to achieve this look. The idea of a tiny, cinched waist became so ingrained in society that it was no longer just a preference. It was an expectation. From the wealthy to the working class, women were lacing themselves into these garments every single day, pushing their bodies further and further into a shape that was unsustainable. But as corsets became tighter, the health risks became even more pronounced. The human body was simply not designed to endure that level of compression. As women continued to wear their corsets for longer hours, their organs were literally being reshaped. The ribs were often pulled inward, causing the chest to flatten and the lungs to struggle to expand. Meanwhile, the stomach and intestines were compressed, leading to digestive problems that were dismissed as female ailments by many medical professionals at the time. One of the more frightening aspects of the corset was its effect on blood circulation. Tight lacing, as it was called, was not just about shaping the waist. It was about restricting movement and forcing the body into a specific mold. As the laces were tightened, blood flow to the lower extremities was often compromised. This led to fainting spells, dizziness, and even long-term nerve damage. It's still unclear whether any doctors or women themselves truly understood the full extent of the dangers. Historians continue to argue whether the widespread health problems caused by corsets were purely the result of fashion, or if they were more about the social expectations surrounding a woman's appearance. The desire to meet society's standards of beauty led many to endure excruciating discomfort, unaware of how much damage they were doing to their bodies. In a world where beauty and social status were inextricably linked, the corset was an essential part of a woman's daily life. But the more rigid and uncomfortable it became, the more women found themselves caught in a paradox. They were told that to be beautiful, they had to suffer. And so, for generations, the corset served as both a symbol of femininity and a silent torturer. But how long could this last? The first signs of rebellion were just around the corner. Historians still debate when and how the first murmurs of dissent against corsetry began. Was it the result of growing awareness of the health risks? Or was it simply the relentless evolution of fashion that made the corset seem old-fashioned? One thing is for certain: the shift away from the corset wasn't immediate. But slowly, society's grip on women's bodies would begin to loosen. But before that change could come, many women would face even greater consequences of their fashion choices. Now that we've explored the ins and outs of how corsets shape the body and the risks they posed, let's take a moment to dive deeper into the specific health consequences. Because, while many women of the era likely didn't recognize the severity of what they were doing to their bodies, the damage was there, quietly but steadily, causing issues that many never fully recovered from. Let's start with the most immediate impact: breathing. To get that perfectly cinched waist, women had to pull their corsets so tightly that their diaphragm was squeezed to the point of non-function. The diaphragm, as you might know, is crucial for breathing. It helps control the expansion of your lungs. But when it's crushed beneath layers of steel and tightly laced fabric, you're left with very little room to breathe deeply. Instead, women were forced to breathe shallowly, with quick, short inhales. This constant struggle for air led to dizziness, fatigue, and an overall sense of weakness. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Then there's the issue of organ displacement. The internal organs weren't made to fit into the shape a corset demanded. When women tightened their corsets to create that perfect silhouette, they were forcing their internal organs into a compressed space. The lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines all had to shift positions, often becoming displaced over time. The stomach, in particular, was severely impacted. When you compress your abdomen like that, digestion becomes more difficult. Many women struggled with constipation, indigestion, and bloating, common side effects of wearing corsets too tightly. But these weren't just temporary problems. Over time, the body became accustomed to being squeezed, and the digestive system began to suffer. There's a lesser-known issue, too: the impact on circulation. The tightness of a corset often restricted blood flow, especially to the lower extremities. The legs and feet would frequently swell, as blood couldn't circulate properly through the body. Women would complain of numbness, tingling sensations, and a general feeling of heaviness. Fainting was another common consequence, as the restricted blood flow made it harder for the body to maintain normal blood pressure. This was compounded by the fact that many women wore their corsets for long hours, sometimes from morning until night. But perhaps the most alarming effect of corsetry was on the spine. In order to achieve the ultra-narrow waist, women would often lean forward or backward to balance out the strain on their ribs and internal organs. Over time, this put immense pressure on the spine and could lead to chronic back pain. In extreme cases, the spine could become deformed, which, considering the rigidity of corsets, often led to long-term issues with posture and mobility. The debate among historians remains as to how much of this damage was truly understood at the time. Some argue that doctors were fully aware of the harm corsets could cause, but ignored it in favor of keeping with the fashion trends. Others suggest that the general public simply didn't know better. In an age where medical knowledge was still evolving, and women were largely excluded from making decisions about their own health, many were willing to endure the risks, believing that it was the price they had to pay for social acceptance and beauty. For many women, the idea that beauty and health were linked became deeply ingrained. If your body didn't conform to the ideal standards of the time, you were seen as less feminine or even less valuable. Wearing a corset, regardless of the health consequences, became a necessary part of daily life, as it was the only way to achieve the slender figure society demanded. But while the health consequences were becoming more apparent, many women were still reluctant to stop wearing them. Why? Because to abandon the corset was to risk being seen as unfashionable, even ugly. The backlash against corsetry didn't just come from the women who wore them. It began to bubble up from medical professionals and reformers who started to challenge the way corsets affected women's health. These early critics spoke out about the dangers of tight lacing and called for more comfortable alternatives. But these voices, though growing louder, faced resistance. Women were so deeply embedded in the tradition of corsetry that simply suggesting they abandon it was like telling them to abandon their entire identity. At the heart of this ongoing tension was a basic question. What was more important, health or beauty? It's a debate that continues even today, but back then, women had few options. Their choices were dictated not only by their own desires, but by society's rigid expectations of them. Corsets weren't just a piece of clothing. They were a lifeline to acceptance, to respect, and to status. The more women tried to break free from the tyranny of fashion, the tighter the grip became. The corset wasn't just part of the outfit. It was part of the larger system of control over women's bodies. And it was going to take a revolution to free them from it. As we continue down the winding path of corsetry, we reach the core of the Victorian woman's experience. Imagine the social landscape of the time, a place where appearance was everything, and the way a woman dressed could determine her worth. Beauty, grace, and decorum were prized above all else, and if you were a woman, your wardrobe was your ticket to being respected or being dismissed. Corsets weren't just about creating an attractive figure. They were a way of marking your place in society. The tight-laced waist, with its impossible dimensions, was the ultimate symbol of feminine virtue. It wasn't just about how you looked. It was about how you were expected to behave. The smaller the waist, the more delicate you were perceived to be. It was as if your ability to suffer for beauty, by literally restricting your breathing and movement, was a testament to your strength, your ability to endure hardship, and your commitment to the ideals of womanhood. If you could wear a corset, you could bear anything. But beneath the ideal of beauty lay a more sinister truth. The corset became a symbol of control. The physical pressure of the garment mirrored the social pressure that women felt to conform to the rigid expectations of the time. The very act of tightening the laces was a daily ritual, a reminder of the lengths to which women had to go to prove their worth. Every woman who wore a corset, regardless of her social status, was subject to these pressures, and while the corset created a physical shape that conformed to societal standards, it also shaped women in a way that went beyond their bodies, pressuring them to be silent, to be obedient, and to be submissive. This pressure wasn't just coming from society at large. Women were encouraged by their families and peers to wear corsets, and often by their husbands. A woman's ability to endure the discomfort and dangers of a corset is in many ways seen as a sign of her devotion to her role as a wife and mother. In the eyes of many, a woman who refused to wear a corset was either lazy or, worse, unrefined. There was no escaping the societal expectation that women should look a certain way, even if it meant sacrificing comfort, health, and sometimes even their very lives. But it wasn't just about the physical act of wearing a corset. There was also the psychological toll that came with the pressure to conform. Women were told that their worth was tied to their appearance. The corset, as restrictive as it was, symbolized the boundaries placed on women in nearly every aspect of life. It was as if their bodies were no longer their own. They were simply tools to create the right image. This cultural fixation on appearance had long-lasting effects on how women saw themselves. The obsession with waist size and figure led to an intense focus on self-discipline and control. Women were expected to maintain their corsets for hours, and when they removed them, they were often faced with painful indentations and bruises, reminders of the beauty they were willing to endure. In a society that valued conformity above all else, standing out by rejecting the corset could feel like an act of rebellion. And in many cases, it was. But while the corset was a tool of submission for many, it also became a point of contention. As the 19th century wore on, whispers of discontent began to grow louder. Some women began to question the cost of beauty, both physically and psychologically. These early critics were not necessarily feminists in the way we understand the term today. but they were challenging the status quo. The corset was, after all, a piece of clothing designed to constrain a woman's body. Could there be a better, less painful way for women to dress? Historians still argue whether this early dissatisfaction was the spark that would ignite the larger feminist movement, or whether it was just another moment of frustration that would fade into the background of social norms. But regardless of the debates, one thing is certain. The corset became more than just an item of clothing. It became a symbol of the limitations imposed on women during the Victorian era. As we look back on this period of history, it's easy to see the corset as both a triumph of fashion and a tragedy of societal expectations. Women were expected to live up to a standard of beauty that was, at best, unattainable, and at worst, dangerous. But even in the face of such adversity, the corset remained a constant, a symbol of the lengths women were expected to go to in order to fit in. Yet, as we'll see in the next sections, this unrelenting fashion would eventually start to fall out of favor as society began to shift. The question that remained was, could women reclaim their bodies, their health, and their lives from the grip of the corset, or would they continue to suffer for the sake of an ideal that seemed impossible to achieve? As the 19th century drew to a close, the corset was still very much a part of everyday life for many Victorian women. However, a growing tide of social change, coupled with shifting views on women's health and autonomy, was about to change everything. The corset, once the pinnacle of femininity, was beginning to face serious challenges, both from within the fashion world and from the growing ranks of health reformers. By the late 1800s, many women had started to feel the physical toll of wearing a corset every day. The damage to internal organs, the pain from tight lacing, and the constant restriction of movement were starting to make themselves felt. More than just health problems. Wearing a corset was beginning to be seen as something of a moral dilemma. After all, wasn't a woman's health just as important as her beauty? The early critiques of corsetry didn't come from a single group, but rather from a mixture of medical professionals, reformers, and women themselves who began to speak out about the detrimental effects of this enduring fashion. The health movement, which was gaining steam at the time, played a key role in challenging the corset. Health reformers argued that women should embrace clothing that allowed for greater freedom of movement and breath. The idea that beauty should never come at the expense of health was becoming more widely accepted. And some early feminists even began to connect the restrictive nature of the corset with broader societal constraints placed on women's bodies and lives. The idea that a woman could be both healthy and beautiful without the use of a corset began to take hold. More and more women began to advocate for more practical clothing options. Some even began to experiment with alternative garments, loosely fitted dresses and undergarments that didn't constrict their bodies in the same way a corset did. These early pioneers of looser fashion were challenging not just a garment, but an entire cultural ideal of femininity. Historians still argue whether the rise of these early health and feminist movements directly contributed to the eventual decline of the corset, or whether it was the fashion industry itself that simply evolved and moved on. But whatever the cause, by the turn of the 20th century, the tight-laced waist was no longer the dominant ideal. Women were beginning to embrace a new form of beauty, one that prioritized comfort and mobility over rigidly defined shapes. The change wasn't instant, of course. Old habits die hard, and for many, the corset was too entrenched in their daily lives to simply be discarded overnight. But, as with all shifts in fashion, the pendulum began to swing away from the tightly corseted silhouette and towards something more relaxed, more modern. This marked the beginning of a new era in women's fashion, one that would set the stage for the sleek, streamlined looks of the early 20th century, where clothing finally began to embrace the natural shape of the body, rather than force it into an unnatural mold. While the corset had its detractors, it still held sway for some time. Some women remained loyal to the garment, not because of any social obligation, but simply out of habit. The allure of the tiny waist remained powerful, and the idea that the corset was a necessary tool for achieving it lingered on in the minds of many. Even as the 20th century began, it was clear that some women were not ready to let go of their beloved corsets, and their persistence ensured that the garment would remain a part of fashion history. But just as the corset had been a symbol of Victorian ideals of femininity and beauty, its gradual decline became a symbol of change. It represented a new generation of women who were less willing to suffer for beauty and more determined to be in control of their own bodies. Slowly but surely, the corset was becoming a thing of the past, replaced by fashion that allowed for greater comfort and freedom. While it didn't disappear overnight, the corset's decline marked the beginning of a transformation in women's fashion that would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century. Women's clothing began to reflect a more natural and less restrictive vision of the female form, one that celebrated comfort and individuality. Yet, the legacy of the corset remains, as we'll explore. Its influence can still be felt today, from the runways of haute couture to the latest trend in waist-cinching garments. The corset is no longer a daily necessity, but its place in the history of fashion and in the history of women's bodies remains undeniable. As the 20th century dawned, the corset's grip on women's fashion began to loosen. The idea that a woman could wear something comfortable and still look good started to take hold. And with that, the strict, uncomfortable corset slowly faded into the background. But even as it was relegated to the past, it left behind a legacy that would echo through the decades, influencing everything from modern fashion to popular culture. One of the key drivers behind the corset's decline was the shift toward more practical, free-flowing clothing. This was a time when women were beginning to claim their independence in more ways than one. The suffragette movement was gaining momentum. Women were entering the workforce in greater numbers, and societal expectations were beginning to shift. As women demanded more freedom in other areas of their lives, it only made sense that they would want more freedom in their clothing, too. In the early 1900s, designers like Paul Poiret and Coco Chanel began to redefine what femininity looked like. They rejected the rigid, constricting garments of the past and introduced styles that allowed for greater movement and comfort. Poiret, in particular, was instrumental in popularizing the liberated silhouette, a looser, more natural shape that was a far cry from the hourglass figures of the Victorian era. His designs were seen as revolutionary, breaking away from the corset's dominance and allowing women to move with ease and grace. By the 1920s, the corset was practically a relic of the past. The flapper style, characterized by straight-line dresses and a more boyish figure, completely rejected the old notion of a tiny waist. The demand for freedom and comfort in women's clothing had reached its peak, and the corset was no longer a necessity. Instead, fashion was embracing a new, modern ideal, one that celebrated the natural body and embraced the notion that women could be both comfortable and beautiful without sacrificing their health. But the corset didn't disappear entirely. Though it was no longer a daily essential, it still lingered in the background of fashion history. In the 1940s and 1950s, The wasp waist returned briefly in the form of the new look introduced by Christian Dior. His designs, with their nipped-in waists and full skirts, evoked the Victorian ideal of femininity. While these dresses didn't require the extreme tight lacing of the past, they still used corsetry to achieve a certain shape. The influence of the corset was still visible, but now it was less about suffocating the body and more about creating a flattering silhouette. The corset's most significant comeback, however, happened in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as designers began to look back to the past for inspiration. Corsets made a resurgence in high fashion and avant-garde designs, where they were no longer seen as a necessary undergarment, but as an artistic element used to shape the body and make a bold statement. Fashion houses like Jean-Paul Gaultier, Vivienne Westwood, and Alexander McQueen have all incorporated corsetry into their collections, using it as a tool to explore themes of gender, power, and identity. Corsets also made their way into mainstream fashion, but this time with a modern twist. The waist-cinching trend, seen in everything from dresses to shapewear, owes a great deal to the corset's enduring legacy. While today's versions are far less extreme, they still rely on the same principles of structure and form. The modern corset is often used for aesthetic purposes rather than necessity, allowing people to achieve an exaggerated waistline without causing harm to their health. But the resurgence of the corset in popular culture hasn't been without controversy. Critics argue that the trend is problematic, as it continues to perpetuate unrealistic beauty standards and a fixation on the female form. The corset, in all its forms, has often been seen as a symbol of women's oppression, both physically and socially. Even though modern corsets are no longer as harmful as their Victorian predecessors, they still evoke the painful history of restrictive fashion and the lengths women went to achieve an idealized figure. Historians continue to debate the true impact of the corset on women's lives. Some view it as a symbol of societal oppression, while others argue that it was merely a product of its time, reflecting the values and ideals of an era when appearance was paramount. What is clear, however, is that the corset has left a lasting imprint on the fashion world. From its origins as a tool for shaping the female body to its modern-day iterations as a fashion statement, the corset's legacy is undeniable. The corset, in all its forms, remains a fascinating and complex part of fashion history. It represents both the beauty and the pain of a bygone era, a time when women were expected to conform to an ideal that was as suffocating as the garment itself. But it also represents the resilience and strength of women who, through fashion, carved out their own space in the world. The corset may have been restrictive, but it was also a symbol of women's enduring desire to shape their own destinies, whether they were doing so voluntarily or not. Now that we've explored the decline of the corset, let's take a closer look at its fascinating relationship with those who wore it, specifically, the women who became symbols of its both alluring and torturous grip. While the corset was certainly a product of societal expectations, it was also shaped by the influence of powerful women who became icons of fashion and, by extension, of corsetry. One of the most influential figures when it came to popularizing corsets was Queen Victoria herself. Her reign, known as the Victorian era, was synonymous with this iconic garment, which became a symbol of propriety and elegance. Queen Victoria was not just a ruler, she was also a trendsetter. During her time, a woman's status was often measured by how well she could embody the ideals of femininity, grace, and decorum, and no garment represented these ideals better than the corset. While Queen Victoria's corset was certainly not as extreme as those worn by later generations, her influence on fashion was undeniable. The royal endorsement of such a garment sent a clear message to the public. If you wanted to be respectable, corsets were the way to go. Her use of the corset reinforced the idea that a small waist was not just a fashion statement. It was a mark of dignity and propriety. As the years went on, other notable women in society also became synonymous with the corset. One such figure was the Duchess of Wellington, who is often credited with popularizing the extreme waistline in the 1830s and 1840s. Her figure, famed for its tiny waist, became the epitome of aristocratic beauty. Women across Europe, and eventually the United States, sought to replicate her look by adopting the tightly laced corsets that achieved that impossibly narrow silhouette. The image of the perfect woman, with her slim waist, full hips, and accentuated bust, became ingrained in society, and the corset became a crucial part of that image. But the issue wasn't just about wearing the corset for the sake of fashion. For many women, it was a matter of status. In a world where outward appearance could determine your worth, a small waist was more than just an aesthetic. It was a symbol of high social standing and respectability. But while the corset was a tool of social advancement, it was also a form of personal torture. Women who wore them regularly spoke of the pain, the difficulty in breathing, and the inability to sit or stand comfortably for long periods of time. And yet, despite these challenges, many women continued to wear corsets, driven by the belief that beauty was worth the sacrifice. The ideal of the tiny waist was so ingrained in the collective consciousness that many women were willing to endure excruciating discomfort in pursuit of that unattainable perfection. Interestingly, there were also women who began to use their influence to challenge the corset and speak out about its negative effects on health. These early reformers, many of whom were pioneers in the fields of health and women's rights, began to question the necessity of such a restrictive garment. Among these voices was the famous suffragette and social reformer, Marie Stopes, who became one of the first to openly critique corsetry's toll on women's health. In her 1918 book, Married Love, she addressed the issue of tight lacing and its adverse effects on women's physical and emotional well-being. Historians still argue about the significance of these early critiques. Some suggest that the growing discomfort with corsets in the early 20th century was directly tied to the rise of feminism and women's suffrage. Others argue that it was more of a natural progression, as women began to embrace more practical, comfortable forms of clothing as society moved forward. Regardless of the reasoning, these early challenges to corsetry marked the beginning of the end for the garment. But the corset wasn't the only tool of societal control. As we've seen, clothing and fashion were deeply intertwined with notions of gender and power. The corset, more than any other garment, was a stark reminder that women's bodies were not their own. They were tools to be shaped and molded according to the desires of society. As fashion evolved throughout the 20th century, the relationship between women and their clothing shifted dramatically. It wasn't just about how a woman looked. It was about how she felt in what she wore and the agency she had to choose what to wear. Today, we see echoes of the corset in modern fashion, particularly in the form of shapewear. While shapewear is a far cry from the extreme corsetry of the Victorian era, it still carries some of the same ideas about shaping the female body. Modern-day waist trainers, for example, have gained popularity in recent years as a way to achieve that same hourglass figure. But these modern iterations, while still restrictive, are far more comfortable and less damaging to the body than their predecessors. They're often marketed as tools for body shaping, not as symbols of societal submission. But even with all the advancements in fashion, the legacy of the corset continues to shape how we think about beauty, control, and the female form. In the 21st century, the pressure to achieve a certain ideal continues to manifest in subtle ways, whether through media, advertising, or even the fashion industry itself. Women are still often told that their bodies must conform to a certain shape in order to be seen as beautiful. So, while the corset may have lost its place in everyday fashion, its influence lingers in modern ideals about beauty and body image. The struggle to find balance between comfort and aesthetic perfection is still an ongoing battle. But one thing is clear: the corset's impact on women's fashion and their bodies will never truly be forgotten. As we reflect on the corset's deep imprint on history, it becomes clear that it wasn't merely a garment. It was a reflection of the times, embodying both the values and contradictions of its era. While it was an essential element of beauty and femininity, it was also a symbol of the physical and psychological toll that society's standards of beauty demanded from women. But what happened when the tides of social change began to turn? When corsets were finally laid to rest? It wasn't just fashion that changed. It was the very way society viewed women's bodies, health, and autonomy. The early 20th century ushered in a time of shifting attitudes, not just about clothing, but about the broader role of women in society. The suffragette movement, with its call for equality and autonomy, played a significant role in challenging the corset and what it represented. Women began to demand more than just the right to vote. They demanded control over their own bodies and lives. Fashion, as a reflection of cultural ideals, had to follow suit. At the turn of the century, designers like Coco Chanel, who favored simplicity and comfort, began to challenge the rigid, ornamental nature of the corset. Chanel, for instance, was known for creating styles that were practical, elegant, and free from the constraints of the past. Her designs, which focused on ease of movement, reflected a growing sense of liberation for women. The old-fashioned idea of women needing to be tightly bound by their clothing was slowly replaced by a new, more liberated approach to fashion. But the end of the corset's dominance didn't mean an immediate abandonment of the desire for an idealized feminine silhouette. Fashion continued to evolve, with the 1920s flapper style rejecting the corset's influence altogether. The straight, boyish figures of flappers rejected the exaggerated curves that corsets had worked so hard to create. It was a bold statement, an affirmation that women could be attractive without being constricted. The flapper style also represented a rebellion against not only the corset, but also the social constraints that had kept women in the roles of subservient wives and mothers. Historians still argue about how quickly these changes took root, and whether they were driven more by fashion or the larger social movements of the time. Some suggest that the corset's decline was inevitable as women's roles in society evolved. Others believe that fashion was just one small part of the larger revolution that women were undergoing during this time. While the corset had lost much of its widespread popularity by the 1920s, its influence did not disappear entirely. As we've seen in previous sections, it returned in various forms throughout the 20th century, often as part of a nostalgic or rebellious statement. Designers like Christian Dior in the 1940s reintroduced the idea of a small waist, though without the extreme tight lacing of earlier corsets. His new look emphasized an hourglass figure, bringing back the full-skirted, waist-cinched silhouette, but with more comfort and mobility than ever before. The desire for a slender waistline never really went away, but the methods of achieving it evolved. Corsetry also made its way into high fashion during the late 20th century and early 21st century, albeit in a much less restrictive form. Designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Vivienne Westwood used corsets as part of their creative explorations of gender, power, and identity. Corsetry became a tool for expressing rebellion, playing with sexual politics, and challenging traditional gender norms, no longer simply about fitting into a prescribed ideal. The corset became a canvas for personal expression, empowering those who wore it to control how their bodies were perceived. At the same time, the 21st century has seen a rise in shapewear, garments that resemble corsets in their function but are marketed as tools for body shaping rather than for extreme constriction. Modern shapewear is made from materials like spandex, allowing for more flexibility and comfort. These garments still promise the same narrow-waisted silhouette that the corset once provided, but with far less of the physical toll. Shapewear is now seen as an accessory to everyday wear, a means of enhancing the body rather than constricting it. Yet, the influence of the corset is unmistakable, continuing to shape contemporary beauty standards in subtle ways. The rise of shapewear speaks to the lasting power of the corset's legacy. While it may no longer be worn for the same reasons, the cultural obsession with the hourglass figure endures. Modern fashion and beauty trends continue to prioritize a small waist and curvy hips, ideals that the corset helped establish, even if it's no longer the garment that enforces them. While the corset may seem like a relic of the past, its cultural legacy still reverberates through the ways we talk about bodies and beauty. The pursuit of an idealized figure, once achieved through tight lacing and physical restriction, has now evolved into a pursuit of contouring, waist training, and body shaping. The ideal of a tiny waist persists, but now it's achieved through more comfortable, if not always healthier, means. In many ways, the corset's evolution reflects the ongoing tension between freedom and control, autonomy and expectation. As society continues to shape and reshape beauty ideals, the legacy of the corset reminds us that fashion is never just about clothing. It's about the ways in which we view and regulate our bodies. As we continue to explore the deep cultural footprint of the corset, we need to pause and reflect on its broader impact, not just on fashion, but on the very concept of women's rights and bodily autonomy. The corset, in many ways, was a tool of social control. It was an object that reinforced a particular set of ideals about how women should look, behave, and exist in society. But as we've seen, the rise of feminism and changing attitudes toward women's rights provided the perfect catalyst for the slow but steady decline of this restrictive garment. At the heart of the corset's legacy lies the question of control. Who controls a woman's body? Who decides what it should look like, how it should move, and how much pain it should endure for the sake of beauty? The corset, with its tight laces and rigid structure, was an embodiment of society's control over women's bodies. It physically restricted movement, breath, and comfort, reinforcing the notion that women's bodies were something to be shaped, confined, and polished to meet societal expectations. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women were increasingly speaking out against this societal control as the suffrage movement gained momentum and women began to assert their rights. The rejection of the corset became a symbol of the larger fight for autonomy. The corset was more than just a piece of clothing. It became a stand-in for all the ways women's bodies were regulated, restricted, and often ignored in favor of the demands of society and men. Historians still argue whether the rejection of the corset was simply part of a broader feminist movement, or whether it was a more organic shift in societal attitudes toward women's clothing and freedom. What is clear, though, is that the changing view of the corset coincided with the growing belief that women should have control over their own lives and, by extension, their own bodies. The growing discomfort with corsetry was closely tied to the rise of the health movement, which emphasized women's well-being and rejected the notion that women's bodies should endure discomfort for the sake of beauty. Medical professionals began to speak out about the harmful effects of tight lacing and the long-term damage it could cause to the internal organs. Women, who had long been told that a small waist was a sign of beauty and respectability, now found themselves confronted with the uncomfortable truth: the corset was dangerous. By the 1910s, the tide had begun to turn. Health advocates and reformers called for more comfortable clothing, encouraging women to embrace looser, more natural garments that allowed for greater movement and health. The first steps toward a more liberated, comfortable style of dress came with designs like the Liberty gown and the relaxed silhouettes of the early 1900s. These designs celebrated the natural body, rejecting the idea that a woman's waist should be forcibly altered for the sake of fashion. At the same time, the suffragette movement, which was pushing for women's right to vote, was also pushing for women's right to define their own bodies. As women fought for equal rights, they also fought for the freedom to exist as they truly were, not as society demanded them to be. The corset, a symbol of social control, became increasingly unpopular, as women rejected the notion that they should have to endure pain to fulfill their roles in society. While these changes were gradual, they marked the beginning of a new era in which women were encouraged to embrace their natural bodies. The corset's decline was tied to the rise of modern women's fashion, where comfort, mobility, and practicality took precedence over the restrictive ideals of the past. No longer was a woman's beauty defined by how tightly she could be cinched into a garment. Instead, beauty began to be defined by individuality, comfort, and the freedom to move and express oneself. But while the corset may have fallen out of favor in everyday life, its cultural impact still lingers in modern society. As we've seen, the idea of shaping the body into a particular silhouette persists today, albeit through less harmful means. Shapewear, for example, allows women to achieve the illusion of a smaller waist without the same dangers of tight lacing. But these garments, while less physically damaging, still play into the same ideals that the corset once reinforced. The idea that a woman's body must conform to a particular image of beauty. The debate around body image, autonomy, and the societal expectations placed on women continues today. Fashion trends may have changed, but the pressure to conform to certain body ideals remains. The corset, in all its forms, still holds a mirror to society's ongoing struggle with how we define beauty, femininity, and autonomy. But the real change, of course, came with the larger societal shifts that challenged not just the corset, but all the ways in which women's bodies were controlled. The corset's decline was part of the broader evolution of women's rights, a revolution that sought to liberate women from the physical, social, and political confines that had long been imposed upon them. And while the corset is no longer a symbol of daily life, its role in shaping the narrative of women's bodies cannot be underestimated. The fight for bodily autonomy, for the freedom to exist and express oneself without restrictions, is still ongoing. The corset's decline may have symbolized the beginning of this fight, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in women's fashion and society. one where women began to reclaim control over how they were portrayed and, more importantly, how they were allowed to exist in the world. The corset's gradual decline throughout the early 20th century was not a sudden revolt, but rather a slow shift that mirrored larger cultural transformations. As women's rights movements gained strength and societal norms about gender roles began to be questioned, the once dominant symbol of female beauty and submission slowly lost its grip. Yet, the cultural and psychological forces that shaped the corset's rise and eventual fall continue to echo through history, influencing how we view fashion, bodies, and personal autonomy today. One of the first signs that the corset's dominance was waning appeared in the form of the health movement. By the turn of the 20th century, medical professionals were beginning to more thoroughly document the harmful effects of tight lacing, with an increasing focus on its detrimental impact on women's organs and overall health. It was no longer just about beauty. People started to recognize that these garments were actively damaging the very bodies they were supposed to enhance. The health movement, at its core, pushed for more comfortable clothing and better access to health care for women. It was about breaking down the physical barriers that restricted women's daily lives. But it wasn't just about comfort. It was a challenge to the idea that women should endure discomfort for the sake of beauty. Women, for the first time, were being encouraged to think about their bodies as more than just objects to be molded into a fashionable shape. They were told to consider their bodies as vital, complex systems that deserved care and respect. With the increasing popularity of this health-conscious approach, many women began to reject the corset outright, looking for alternatives that offered both freedom and elegance. Designs began to emerge that didn't rely on tight lacing, but instead embraced looser, more fluid silhouettes. The empire waist, for example, which had gained popularity earlier in the 19th century, made a strong comeback during the early 1900s. Its high waistline and flowing design allowed women to move freely, without the restriction of tight garments. This was, in many ways, a direct rejection of the corset, symbolizing a shift toward a more natural, less confined understanding of the female form. But these shifts didn't occur overnight. The corset remained popular for a time, especially among upper-class women who still viewed it as a status symbol. For some, the corset was synonymous with refinement, beauty, and social standing. They couldn't easily relinquish what had long been considered a cornerstone of femininity. The tight-laced silhouette still commanded respect, and many women clung to it, unwilling to abandon what they believed was an essential part of their appearance. Meanwhile, on the other side of the cultural spectrum, the suffragette movement and the burgeoning feminist ideals began to chip away at these traditional norms. Women fighting for the right to vote and for the right to own their own bodies saw the corset as a physical manifestation of the gender depression they were actively resisting. The fight for equality in the political and social spheres was inevitably tied to the fight for bodily autonomy. The rejection of restrictive garments like the corset became a symbol of this broader struggle for freedom. As the decades progressed, particularly with the advent of the World Wars, clothing became more practical and functional. Women were entering the workforce in larger numbers, taking on roles traditionally held by men, and had little time for the discomfort of corsets. Fashion was being reshaped to accommodate the needs of working women who needed clothing that allowed for ease of movement, practicality, and comfort. The first truly modern styles were born during this time, styles that no longer focused on restrictive waistlines, but instead on freedom of movement and personal expression. In the mid-20th century, the shape of the feminine form continued to be a source of fascination for both designers and society. Christian Dior's new look in 1947 brought back a waistline-focused silhouette, but without the severe constriction of the old corsets. Dior's designs were revolutionary in their own right, using structured garments to create an hourglass figure, but incorporating modern materials and techniques that prioritized comfort. While the hourglass shape may have been revisited, the harshness of tight lacing was abandoned. But even as the corset receded into history, it never fully disappeared. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, we've seen a resurgence of corsetry in high fashion. Designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Vivienne Westwood have used corsets not just as a tool to shape the body, but as an artistic statement. The corset has been transformed from a painful garment of necessity into a symbol of rebellion, power, and subversion. These modern interpretations are far removed from their Victorian ancestors, embracing corsetry as a form of self-expression rather than submission. In recent years, we've also seen the rise of waist trainers, a modern version of the corset, promoted as a tool for achieving an hourglass figure. While these garments are much less extreme than their Victorian counterparts, they still rely on the same underlying idea, that a woman's body must fit a certain ideal. The rise of body-shaping garments in contemporary fashion highlights that. While the corset as we once knew it may be gone, the cultural desire for an idealized body continues to persist. The legacy of the corset, however, extends far beyond fashion. It represents an ongoing struggle over women's rights, self-image, and autonomy. The corset is not just a piece of clothing. It is a symbol of the cultural pressures that women have faced and continue to face regarding their bodies. It reminds us that the body has always been a battleground, a space where personal freedom and societal expectations collide. While the corset may no longer be the defining garment of our time, its influence can still be seen in the ways we talk about beauty, body image, and the pressures women experience to fit into certain molds. Even today, the conversation around body autonomy and self-expression is ongoing. Fashion, while less restrictive than in the days of the corset, is still a reflection of societal values and expectations. As women continue to challenge the status quo, we must ask ourselves, how much of our own desires and perceptions of beauty are truly ours? And how much are influenced by the same pressures that once made the corset an essential part of the female wardrobe? As we've navigated the journey of the corset, from its rise to its decline and eventual return in modern fashion, it's clear that its cultural significance extends far beyond the confines of the fashion world. The corset became a symbol of beauty, status, and, in many cases, the control society wielded over women's bodies. But as we move further into the 20th and 21st centuries, the narrative of the corset begins to change. It becomes not just a garment, but a reflection of evolving ideas about women's autonomy, body image, and self-expression. By the 1960s and 1970s, the fashion industry had begun to prioritize freedom, comfort, and casual wear. The corset, with its rigid structure and painful connotations, was no longer at the forefront of everyday fashion. Instead, clothing became more relaxed, fluid, and focused on comfort, spurred on by the liberation movements that had redefined the social and political landscape. This shift in style was emblematic of the greater social change taking place. Women were asserting their rights to be more than just objects of beauty. They were fighting for the right to exist freely, without having to suffer for the sake of their appearance. However, the echoes of the corset continued to reverberate, particularly in high fashion. Designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Vivienne Westwood known for their avant-garde and rebellious styles, began to bring the corset back into the fashion spotlight. But this time, it wasn't about suffocating the body to achieve a desirable form. It was about using the corset as a tool of empowerment, expression, and even subversion. Corsetry in these contexts was no longer about conforming to societal ideals. It was about challenging them. Jean-Paul Gaultier, in particular, made headlines with his iconic use of corsetry in the 1990s. His famous cone-shaped corsets, most notably worn by Madonna during her 1990s Blonde Ambition tour, took the corset into a new realm. Instead of the tightly laced, restrictive garment of the past, Gaultier's corsets were bold, sculptural pieces that redefined femininity in a way that was playful and empowering. Madonna, in these iconic outfits, wasn't just wearing a corset, she was reclaiming it, using it as an emblem of power, confidence, and self-expression. It was a clear message. The corset didn't have to be a symbol of oppression. It could be a statement of freedom. Similarly, Vivienne Westwood's use of corsetry, particularly in her punk-inspired collections, brought a raw, rebellious energy to the once mourned garment. For Westwood, the corset was about more than shape. It was about shaking up norms and challenging what people expected from fashion. She used corsetry to subvert traditional notions of femininity, making it a powerful symbol of resistance, creativity, and individuality. Even as the corset took on new, avant-garde forms in high fashion, it began to re-enter the mainstream through the rise of modern shapewear. While shapewear differs significantly from its Victorian predecessor in terms of comfort and design, the concept of body manipulation remains the same. Shapewear, which became particularly popular in the early 2000s, promised to help women achieve an hourglass figure without the discomfort of a traditional corset. The appeal of a small waist and full hips remained a central beauty ideal, and shapewear was marketed as a tool to achieve that look in a more comfortable, less invasive way. However, the irony remains. Despite the improvements in design, shapewear still plays into the same societal pressures and beauty standards that corsets once did. As we reflect on these shifts in the cultural use of corsetry, we can't help but notice how the idea of beauty and body shape has continued to evolve alongside technological advancements in fashion. Even today, body shaping remains a prominent aspect of the fashion industry. From waist trainers to the pervasive desire for the perfect body shape seen in advertising, fitness trends, and even social media. Despite all the progress, the ideal of a small waist and curvy figure persists, sometimes to a point of obsession. Modern fashion may have moved away from the harshest forms of corsetry, but the concept of shaping the female body to fit an ideal is still alive and well. One might argue that while modern body-shaping garments like shapewear are less physically restrictive, they still carry the same cultural baggage as the corset. The question remains, do these garments give women more autonomy, or do they merely offer a modern version of the same constraints? While many women today may wear shapewear for convenience or self-confidence, the underlying pressure to conform to a specific ideal, whether it's achieved through corsetry, shapewear, or diet culture, can still be felt. It's important to note that, alongside the rise of body-shaping garments, a larger movement toward body positivity has also gained momentum in recent years. More and more, people are embracing diverse body types and rejecting the notion that there is one right way to look. This shift, in some ways, can be seen as a counterpoint to the corset's legacy. Instead of conforming to an ideal, women and men are reclaiming their bodies and celebrating their individuality. The body positivity movement challenges the notion that beauty requires sacrifice and restriction. It's a powerful push against the idea that women must constantly be reshaped and redefined to fit a prescribed mold. Of course, this revolution in body image and self-expression is far from complete, and the cultural forces that push us toward an ideal body shape are still strong. But the fight for autonomy over one's own body, freedom from external pressures and expectations, continues. The corset, as a symbol of restriction, may have largely faded into the past, but its influence is still deeply ingrained in the ways we understand beauty, identity, and self-worth. Looking ahead, the question remains: will we continue to redefine beauty, or will we see a return to old-fashioned ideals? The corset, once the epitome of social control and conformity, has transformed into a symbol of rebellion and self-expression. The journey from its restrictive roots to its modern iterations reflects not only changes in fashion, but a broader cultural shift toward individualism, autonomy, and the rejection of one-size-fits-all beauty standards. As we near the end of our exploration of the corset's fascinating history, it's important to reflect on how it has come full circle in modern culture. What was once a restrictive garment that shaped the female body into a small-waisted ideal has now evolved into a symbol of empowerment and self-expression, albeit with some lingering echoes of its oppressive past. The corset's legacy, both positive and negative, continues to shape how we view fashion, beauty, and gender in the 21st century. In the contemporary fashion world, the corset has undergone a remarkable transformation. No longer seen solely as an instrument of pain and conformity, it has been reimagined as a tool for creative self-expression. The rise of haute couture and avant-garde fashion has given designers the freedom to experiment with corsetry, using it as a canvas to explore themes of power, gender, and identity. Designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Alexander McQueen have redefined the corset, turning it from a painful, rigid garment into an art form. Their work often challenges traditional ideas about femininity and power, using the corset to push boundaries and challenge norms. For example, Gaultier's 1990s cone-shaped corsets, famously worn by Madonna, are an iconic example of how the corset can be used as a tool of empowerment, rather than the constricting, waist-slimming corsets of the past. Gaultier's designs were bold, sculptural, and at times subversive. The corset, in his hands, became a statement of strength, sexuality, and individuality. Madonna, a pop culture icon known for breaking barriers, wore these corsets with confidence, embodying the idea that beauty is not about conforming to a set standard, but about embracing your own power and identity. Similarly, designers like Vivienne Westwood have used the corset to challenge traditional gender norms. In her punk-inspired collections, Westwood employed the corset as both a symbol of rebellion and an emblem of female empowerment. Instead of using it to adhere to societal standards of beauty, she turned it into an expression of defiance. In doing so, she helped shift the corset from a symbol of submission to one of resistance. A powerful message in a time when women were beginning to demand more control over their bodies and lives. However, as fashion continues to evolve, so too does the conversation about the corset. Despite its reimagining in high fashion and modern-day clothing, the corset's historical baggage is still hard to shake. Today, the corset is often incorporated into fashion in ways that highlight the tension between freedom and restriction. the resurgence of corset-inspired designs, such as waist trainers and corset-style tops, raises questions about body image and societal expectations. While these garments are not as physically harmful as their Victorian ancestors, they still tap into the same desire for a particular body shape, a tiny waist, an exaggerated hourglass silhouette that has been ingrained in our culture for centuries. The rise of waist trainers in particular has been both celebrated and criticized. On one hand, they promise to help women achieve the coveted snatched waist without the extreme discomfort of a full corset. On the other hand, they perpetuate the same ideals of beauty that have been challenged by the body positivity movement. While waist trainers are marketed as a way to enhance the body's natural shape, they still feed into the cultural fixation on the hourglass figure, a figure that, for many, remains unattainable without some form of artificial shaping. This ongoing relationship between the corset and modern beauty standards has sparked debate. Some argue that waist trainers and corset-inspired fashion are empowering because they allow women to control how their bodies are shaped, providing them with tools to express themselves. Others suggest that these garments are just another form of societal pressure, a modern-day version of the same ideals that women once struggled against in the days of tight lacing. At the heart of this debate is the ongoing struggle for bodily autonomy and self-expression. The corset's decline in the early 20th century symbolized a fight against societal norms that sought to control women's bodies. Today, the battle is no less relevant, as women continue to challenge the ideals imposed upon them by the fashion industry and the media. The resurgence of corset-inspired garments may reflect a desire to reclaim control over one's appearance, but it also serves as a reminder of the enduring power of beauty standards to shape our perceptions of ourselves. As we continue to redefine beauty, it's essential to consider how we can move beyond restrictive ideals. The corset's transformation from a symbol of oppression to one of empowerment reflects the larger cultural shifts we've seen in recent decades. Women today are embracing their bodies, flaws and all, and rejecting the notion that their value is tied to how closely they conform to a certain ideal. Body positivity, which has gained momentum in the 21st century, encourages people of all shapes and sizes to love and appreciate their bodies as they are, without feeling the need to reshape themselves to fit an arbitrary standard of beauty. And yet, even with these cultural shifts, it's impossible to ignore the corset's enduring influence. The desire to shape and mold the body remains a powerful force in fashion and culture. Whether through shapewear, waist trainers, or even cosmetic surgery, the ideal of the perfect body continues to drive trends and dictate what is considered beautiful. The corset, in all its forms, remains a constant reminder of how closely fashion and body image are tied together. As we move forward, it is essential to continue questioning the ideals that have shaped our understanding of beauty and femininity. The corset, as both a garment and a cultural symbol, offers a valuable lesson that beauty is not something that should be confined or constrained. True beauty comes from within, from the freedom to express yourself without fear of judgment, and from the acceptance of your body as it is, without the need for artificial shaping or restriction. The story of the corset is not just a tale of fashion, it is a tale of societal change, personal agency, and the ongoing fight for bodily autonomy. Its legacy, both empowering and problematic, continues to resonate today, reminding us that the way we choose to dress, shape, and express our bodies is an ongoing conversation, one that we can choose to shape for ourselves, free from the constraints of outdated ideals. As we approach the final chapter in our exploration of the corset's fascinating history, we must consider the true impact this iconic garment has had on the way we view the female body, fashion, and societal expectations. While the corset itself may no longer be a daily necessity, its legacy continues to echo through the modern world. The journey of the corset, from a symbol of beauty, control, and conformity to a tool of self-expression and rebellion, provides valuable insight into how fashion evolves in response to cultural, political, and social change. In reflecting on the history of the corset, it's impossible to ignore the role it played in shaping women's identities. For centuries, the corset was the epitome of femininity. It defined what it meant to be a respectable woman, a beautiful woman, and, in many cases, a successful one. Women who adhered to this ideal were praised for their discipline, their commitment to beauty, and their ability to endure the discomfort that came with tight lacing. In a society where women's worth was often determined by their appearance, the corset provided a means of achieving the perfect body, a body that conformed to societal standards, no matter the cost. But the corset also tells a story of resistance. Over time, as women fought for their rights and autonomy, the corset became a symbol of the control that society had over their bodies. The push for suffrage, the rise of feminism, and the growing awareness of the harmful effects of restrictive clothing all contributed to the eventual decline of the corset's dominance. This was not just a rejection of fashion. It was a rejection of the ideals and limitations that the corset represented. The modern-day reinterpretation of the corset is just as complex. On one hand, corsetry in high fashion is used as a tool for personal expression and empowerment. Designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Vivienne Westwood have transformed the corset from an oppressive garment into a symbol of individuality and defiance. Corsets now appear on runways as part of avant-garde designs, subverting traditional gender norms and celebrating the female form in a new light. Instead of being a symbol of submission, the corset has become a weapon of choice for those who want to challenge the status quo and redefine beauty on their own terms. On the other hand, the rise of waist trainers and modern shapewear demonstrates that the societal pressure to conform to a particular body ideal is still very much alive. These garments, though more comfortable than their historical counterparts, still carry the weight of the corset's legacy. Waist trainers promise a smaller waist and an exaggerated hourglass shape, and they've become a mainstay in the beauty industry. While they may not pose the same physical dangers as the corset once did, they still perpetuate the same desire to alter the natural shape of the body. The underlying message remains the same. The ideal female body is one that conforms to a specific set of measurements, regardless of the cost. It's important to acknowledge the complexity of this situation. While modern shapewear offers a more comfortable and accessible way to achieve the desired shape, it still reflects the deeply ingrained societal obsession with body perfection. Women, and increasingly men, are bombarded with images of the ideal body, slim, curvy, and symmetrical, and many feel pressured to meet these standards, whether through dieting, exercise, or body-shaping garments. The pursuit of the perfect body continues to dominate the conversation about beauty. But alongside this continued obsession with physical appearance, there has been a rising tide of body positivity and acceptance. The body positivity movement, which encourages people of all shapes, sizes, and backgrounds to embrace their natural bodies, has become a powerful force in modern culture. This movement has challenged the traditional beauty standards that were so deeply rooted in corsetry and other restrictive fashion trends. It has given people the freedom to appreciate and love their bodies as they are, without the need for artificial shaping or restriction. The corset, in its many forms, is a reminder of how far we've come in terms of body autonomy and self-expression. The fact that we can now engage in conversations about body image and beauty standards without the constant pressure to conform to a singular ideal represents a victory for those who fought to free themselves from the corset's grip. And yet, the journey is not over. While the corset may no longer physically bind women as it once did, the societal pressure to conform to certain beauty standards remains a powerful force in many people's lives. As we look ahead, we must continue to ask ourselves, what does beauty truly mean, and who gets to define it? The story of the corset is ultimately about the struggle for freedom, autonomy, and self-expression. It is about rejecting the notion that beauty is something that must be earned or attained through pain and sacrifice. True beauty, as we are learning, comes from within. It is about the freedom to be yourself, without the need to fit into an arbitrary mold. The legacy of the corset is one of transformation, of a garment that once defined and confined women, but now serves as a symbol of strength, resistance, and self-expression. The corset's journey, from symbol of oppression to a tool of empowerment, mirrors the broader changes in society's views on gender, power, and beauty. As we continue to redefine beauty in a way that celebrates individuality, the story of the corset reminds us of the importance of reclaiming control over our bodies and our lives. So, as we end our journey through the history of the corset, let us remember that it is not just a piece of clothing. It is a symbol of the ongoing fight for bodily autonomy, equality, and freedom of expression. The corset, in all its forms, represents both the constraints and the liberation of women throughout history. And while it may no longer hold the same power it once did, its legacy will continue to shape the way we think about beauty, identity, and self-worth for generations to come.